So good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 10th chapter of our trek through Jewish history here. So just a little bit of overview and review of where we're at in history. This is going to be our second out of 3 different classes on the medieval era. And so where we're at just in the big bird's eye view span of history is we are now after the year 1000. And we discussed last time that the year 1000 was a watershed movement for Jewish history. And that's when Babylonia ceased to be a major Jewish center and Jews began immigrating out west to wider Europe, and specifically Spain becoming the new de facto Jewish center of the world in a cultural and religious and philosophic sense. Something that I actually forgot to say last week, but just so we can get a sense of how unique the situation was for Jews in Spain between the year 1000 and let's say 1200. Spain obviously was at the center of many wars, both between Islam and Christianity, and also inter-Islamic wars from the 1200s to 1500s. But once we're back closer to the year 1000 CE, there was actually a Jewish prime minister of Spain, a man named Shmuel HaNagid. And so just to get a sense of how unique of a breeding ground for new Jewish ideas and new cultural practices and new types of ways of thinking of Judaism in Spain in the year 1000 to 1200, right? Thinking of how we oftentimes stereotype Jewish history, which is the wandering Jew of right when you get comfortable in a place, you're getting kicked out. There is a lot of truth to that. And sadly, the Jewish tenure in Spain also, of course, ends with expulsion. But there also are times in Jewish history where things are good, and it's also important to highlight those. And so the story of Jewish history doesn't have to be a story of expulsion and pogrom and exile, and then now in the 20th century, the Holocaust and giving birth to the modern state of Israel, right? You can also tell an equally compelling story of Jewish history of a series of successes and failures and ups and downs and peaks and troughs, as nothing in a historical setting is all good or all bad. Ruth is noting here the lachrymose theory of Jewish history. So I was internally thinking if I should go there. So I will for a second. There was a famous, actually the first American Jewish studies professor was a man named Sala Baron, and he was the first Jewish historian to get an appointment at any American university. And he wrote a very famous paper where he challenges what he deems to be the lachrymose theory of Jewish history. And what he says, and again, this is, I think, in the 1910s or 1920s, he says that there's a tendency among Jewish historians, right, they were mostly in Europe, to depict Jewish history as being, we are these poor, wretched victims that have been sort of the ragdoll of the world, and we've had very little agency, and everybody's beat up on us. And the entire point of his essay, and one of the things that he spent his career doing, is not necessarily saying the negatives aren't true, because of course they are, and there has been those darker moments in our history, but specifically trying to elevate what he calls the autonomous Jewish acts of history, which are ways in which we have been the primary autonomous force of our own history, as opposed to talking about Jewish history through the lens of people that have wanted to harm us. And so just to put that out there, right, we're talking now about what a lot of scholars deem to be the golden age of Spain. Even that term, again, is a little bit controversial because you can ask 3 people and say golden age of Spain, and you get a multiplicity of different strong emotions, right? Some are very quick to point out that the so-called golden age of Spain from about 1000 to, let's say, 13 or 1400, depending on exactly where, wasn't actually so perfect because Jews under Islamic rule still were given what's called dhimmi status, which effectively made them second-class citizens, and that came with a whole series of laws. Just a couple of them was there was a special tax that all minorities had to pay. There were certain communal laws, such as a synagogue was not allowed to be higher than a mosque, right? In the public sphere, nothing Jewish was allowed. Jews always had to defer to Muslims, right, on any sort of social setting. On the other hand, dhimmi status came with a legal protection. And if Jews, or also this applied to Christians under Islamic rule, paid attention to these laws and paid the tax and sort of kept a low profile, they were given complete freedom of religion to practice however they wanted. This is, of course, very different than if we look to the rest of Europe of Judaism under Christian rule, which, of course, in the year 1000 and 1100 and 1200 was in the midst of the Crusades and in the midst of just waves and waves of anti-Semitism, right? This is when the blood libel was happening in England. This is when Jews were being blamed everywhere for Christians that disappeared or went murdered. Jews were blamed for the Black Plague eventually in Europe. And Jews, of course, were never given any type of protective status under Christendom. And so this is where we are at today in the Jewish world. And just to share my screen here, just so we can go over that same map from last week, is we are here in the year 1000 CE, right? Spain has ceased to be a center of the Jewish world. And now we have divided into the different ethnic or social subcategories of Judaism that we've maintained until more or less the 20th century. And of course, we have the Sephardic Jews that are in North Africa, Spain, and Portugal, Ashkenazi Jews in the rest of Europe, and Mizrahi or Middle Eastern Jews in the wider Middle East. So the entire class today, right? So we spoke last time about a couple of the different challenges that were unique to both Ashkenazi and Sephardi/Mizrahi Jewry. And one of the things that we teased out last week was different types of literature, or the production of different types of Judaism almost from these different communities. Because oftentimes, again, a community is never an insular thing. Even if Jews were relegated to living in certain areas under Christian rule, you're always going to be affected by the dominant sociology of the culture that's around you. And so Ashkenazi Jews produced a certain type of literature, and Sephardic Jews produced other types of literature. And so today we're going to zoom in on possibly one of the most important figures in Jewish history. I brought actually a picture of his tombstone in the modern city of Tiberia or Tiberias in Israel. So this says in Hebrew, Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimon, or another way of saying that is Maimonides. And he has this famous quote, which was first said at his eulogy, Mim Moshe ad Moshe lo kam ke Moshe, right? Which means from Moses to Moses, right? The first Moses is, of course, the Moses in the Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu. The second Moses is Moses Maimonides. Lo kam ke Moshe, right? Nobody ever arose that was as great as Moshe. And so just to get a sense of how important of a figure this is, up on his tombstone in the middle of the city of Tiberia, right, a beautiful gravesite, you have this epithet that this is the greatest Jewish thinker since Moses. So basically, this guy is the new Moses, right? Moses, of course, is the most famous central prophet of the Torah. And so this is, of course, a very high bar for any other person to reach. And it begs the question, which we'll spend the bulk of today talking about, what was so important and great about Maimonides that not only is he deemed sort of the second Moses, but he is probably the most recognizable name in Judaism in the post-Torah era, and not just to Jews. What I mean by that is there are hospitals all over the world that are named Maimonides. If anybody here takes a freshman introductory to philosophy class or a first-year law school class, oftentimes you'll end up reading excerpts from Maimonides' work. And so who was this revolutionary thinker that changed not just Judaism fundamentally, but really added to the Western canon in a way that is still being studied today over 1,000 years later? So that's going to be our central question today of who was Maimonides and what did he do that was so radical. Now, just to set the setting here, so this is, of course, all taking place in Spain in the medieval era, and Maimonides grew up in the south of Spain, sometime in the late 12th century. And one of the important things just to classify his life, just thinking about, again, a lot of these tensions of Jewish history, is a more radical sect of Islam actually took hold in the early 1200s and swept its way through North Africa and conquered some of southern Spain, right as Maimonides was going through his formative years. And so very early on in his life, Maimonides went from a situation that he was under this protected dhimmi status to basically effectively going into exile. And he ends up spending his early life in Spain, but he ends up then living in Fez, Morocco, and ultimately spending the rest of his life in Egypt. And so Maimonides was a Sephardic or Mizrahi Jew par excellence, and he sort of was able to internalize a lot of the social tensions that were happening in the Sephardic world at this time. Now, what were these tensions? So we talked about this a little bit last week, which was for Spain in the Middle Ages, the dominant culture was one of intellectualism, cosmopolitanism, right? All of these different ideas. And one way to think of this is the Greco-Roman philosophic tradition basically jumped from the Middle East over to the center of the Islamic world, which was having a renaissance in Spain. And so we discussed this a little bit last week, but a lot of Greek philosophy, even our modern notion of mathematics, a lot of geometry, a lot of this stuff was basically cultivated by the medieval Islamic world, again, all taking place in this cosmopolitan area of Spain. And so other times in Jewish history, where Jews at any local area are obviously interacting with the dominant culture, Sephardic Jews in Spain, their biggest fear and the biggest threat that Jewish communal leaders were thinking about was not the fact that they're afraid that Jews are going to get killed by the wider culture, but it's that Jews are going to engulf the wider culture so much that they actually don't want to be Jewish anymore. Because the ideas of philosophy, right? And again, this is before anybody would call it secularism. So I don't want to call it secularism, but the ideas of Greek philosophy, which some might call secularism, were growing at a rate where that was, in some sense, the biggest threat to the future of Judaism. And so Maimonides makes it his entire life's mission to try to figure out a way to bridge these two seemingly unbridgeable worlds, right? Athens and Jerusalem, right? You have the Jewish tradition of monotheism with the Greek tradition of philosophy. These two different traditions seem diametrically opposed to each other for a whole variety of reasons that we'll get into. And Maimonides all of a sudden comes up, and he is this sort of extremely intelligent, right? Both Jewishly literate and philosophically literate person and thinker. And he spends his entire life trying to bridge this gulf in a way that his ideas 1,000 years later aren't just interesting and transformative because of what he says, but the methodology that he uses to try to bridge the gap between Judaism and an outside culture is one that is still used today by virtually all Jewish denominations. And so Maimonides becomes not just important for what he said and did 1,000 years ago, but he really sets a path forward in motion that some might argue, and I'm certainly one of these, that has allowed Judaism to confront virtually any intellectual challenge that it ever comes into collision with, really for all time. And we can go over a couple of the ways in which he did that. And a couple of his ideas, by the way, just one more thing by introduction, a couple of these ideas aren't even going to seem so incredible to people here, not because they're not incredible, but because I would guess half of these ideas, everybody will be thinking in their head, well, of course, I knew that. I was told that in Hebrew school when I was 8 years old. Well, the reason why we study history is to figure out, well, how did some of these ideas catch on to the extent that virtually all Jews would say, oh, of course you don't need to interpret the Genesis creation story as literal history. Of course, Jews can believe in evolution while still affirming the fundamental truth of Genesis. Well, the reason why we're able to do that to some extent was because of this path set into motion by Maimonides. Last thing by way of introduction, just to read a fun letter, just to get a sense of Maimonides' daily schedule. And this is, again, we talked a little bit last week about the Cairo Geniza, right? This cache of letters and texts that were written over the course of hundreds of years in the synagogue in Cairo. But this was found just to get a sense of who Maimonides was. And this was in the context of a series of back and forths. Maimonides had an old friend from Spain that was coming to visit the Middle East and wrote Maimonides a letter saying, can you find time to get lunch with me? And this is what Maimonides said. So he said, I live in Fostat and the Sultan lives in Cairo. The distance between them is 4,000 cubits, a mile and a half. My duties to the Sultan are very heavy. So we already learned something about Maimonides, something that was known a little bit before, but comes across in his letters, that Maimonides was not just a Talmudist and a Jewish legal scholar and a philosopher, he was also a doctor. And not only was he a doctor, but he was such a famous doctor that he was the doctor to the Sultan of Egypt. He was also the doctor of Saladin, right? Saladin was the Islamic conqueror that took back a lot of the land that was taken by the Crusaders, right? So this isn't just he was a doctor. He was the equivalent to, if we imagine in contemporary America, the doctor to the president, right? That's who Maimonides ended up being. So he goes every morning to check on the health of the Sultan. If one day he doesn't feel well, or one of the princes or one of the women of the harem don't feel well, I cannot leave Cairo that day. It also happens that there is often an officer or two who need me, and I have to attend healing them all day. Therefore, as a rule, I am in Cairo early each day, and even if nothing unusual happens, by the time I come back to Fostat, half the day is gone. Under no circumstances do I come earlier. And I am ravenously hungry by then. When I come home, my foyer is always full of people, Jews and non-Jews, important people and not, judges and policemen, people who love me and people who hate me, a mixture of all people, all who have been waiting for me to come home. I get off my donkey, wash my hands, and go out into the hall to see them. I apologize and ask that they should be kind enough to give me a few minutes to eat. This is the only meal I take in 24 hours. Then I go out to heal them, write them prescriptions and instructions for treating their problems. Patients go in and out until nightfall, and sometimes, I swear to you by the Torah, it is 2 hours into the night before they are gone. I talk to them and prescribe for them even while lying down on my back from exhaustion. And when night begins, I am so weak I cannot even talk anymore. Because of this, no Jew can come and speak with me in wisdom or have a private audience with me, because I have no time except for Shabbat. On Shabbat, the whole congregation, or at least the majority of it, comes to my house after morning services. I instruct the members of the community as what they should do during the entire week. We learn together in a weak fashion until the afternoon. Then they all go home. Some of them come back and I teach more deeply between the afternoon and evening prayers. So this is, again, towards the second half of his life, a letter of what Maimonides used to do on an average day. And again, this was not a slacker, right? So Maimonides was quite the overachiever. And one of the legacies that we're actually going to see come out in some of his texts, he ends up being somewhat of an elite thinker and an elitist. And this is, again, when, complicating the legacy of great historical people, right? I think we're at a stage of history now where we understand that nobody in history is either all good or all bad. And Maimonides was not shy in praising himself. And that's something that certainly comes out in a lot of the writing. And so Maimonides, again, you can think of him, right? He very quickly, right after he moves to Egypt, he becomes the head of the Jewish community in Egypt. He ends up traveling to Israel a couple of times. He ends up going onto the Temple Mount. He was one of the few Jews in the Middle Ages to do that. But you can imagine him living this life in multiple different cultural spheres. And this is somewhat of a rare situation for a medieval Jew, right? You can imagine he had his Jewish side of his identity, where he is, of course, celebrating Shabbat and talking about Jewish learning, and he wrote many responsa to different communities. Then he had his sort of more academic, intellectual side, right? He was the doctor, and then he would also hang out among philosophers and was engaged in a lot of the philosophy at this time. And so these sociological conditions all intersect to the point where Maimonides thinks to himself that the biggest threat to Judaism is intellectual challenges. And he goes out to write a book called The Guide to the Perplexed, or More Nevuchim, right? And in this Guide to the Perplexed, and we'll read a little bit about it in his introduction, but he wants to suggest that he has found a path to try to reconcile Judaism and Greek philosophy. So just to read a little bit of the introduction, and then we can have a conversation before we go to a couple of specific examples. So what he says is as follows. The object of this treatise is to enlighten a religious man who has been trained to believe in the truth of our holy law who conscientiously fulfills his moral and religious duty, and at the same time has been successful in his philosophic study. So he says, I am writing this book for good religious Jews who are also intellectual philosophers and thinking about issues critically. Human reason has attracted him to abide within its sphere, and he finds it difficult to accept as correct the teaching based on the literal interpretation of the law, and especially that which he himself or others derived from these synonymous, metaphorical, or hybrid expressions. So basically, these thinkers, as philosophers themselves, find it very difficult to then go to synagogue every Shabbat, open up the Torah, and take it seriously. Because on the one hand, you're reading all about this advanced science or philosophy. On the other hand, you go to synagogue on Shabbat, and you're reading stories of miracles and things that are, in Maimonides' words, quote unquote, non-rational or non-philosophical. So hence, he is lost in perplexity and anxiety. So this is a person, right? This is the state of being of a person who is completely anxious and doesn't know what to do. And this is the state, again, of many of the Jews at the time. Because what would happen if he be guided solely by reason and renounce his previous views, which are based on these expressions? He would consider that he had rejected the fundamental principles of the law. And even if he retained the opinions which were derived from these expressions, and if instead of following his reason, he abandoned its guidance altogether, it would still appear that his religious convictions had suffered loss and injury, right? So what are this guy's two choices? If he decides that he should reject Judaism, then he has no more identity, right? He has completely lost in his religion. And if he decides, well, I'm just going to ignore the philosophic, analytical, scientific side of what's going on, your religious convictions are still going to suffer loss, right? Once the seeds of doubt are sowed in a religious thinker, it is very hard to uproot those seeds. For then he would be left with these errors, which give rise to fear and anxiety, constant grief, and great perplexity. And so he sets up, right, this is the very beginning of the introduction, basically describing a individual, but really a sociological condition, one in which I think in the 20th and 21st century, a lot of us can intuitively identify with, right? So just as a small in parentheses, right, this is just another way in which it becomes obvious from the study of Jewish history that a lot of our contemporary sociological and philosophical challenges are not necessarily unique. They might be unique in form, but they're not necessarily unique in kind. And so Maimonides continues in his introduction, and then we'll pause a few moments for questions and conversation. The thinker whose studies have brought him into collision with religion will, as I have already mentioned, derive much benefit from each chapter. How greatly will he enjoy? How agreeable will my words strike his ears? Those, however, whose minds are confused with false notions and perverse methods, who regard their misleading studies as sciences and imagine themselves philosophers, though they have no knowledge that can truly be termed science will object to many chapters and will find in them many insuperable difficulties because they do not understand their meaning, and because I expose therein the absurdity of their perverse notions which constitute their riches and peculiar treasure stored up in their ruins. God knows that I hesitated very much before writing on the subjects contained in this work, since they are profound mysteries. They are topics which, since the time of our captivity, have not been treated by any of our scholars as far as we possess their writings. How then shall I now make a beginning and discuss them? So he says something else important. He says there's going to be a lot of people who really hate what I'm about to say. There's going to be a lot of people in the Jewish community that are going to read this and under what he considers to be erroneous worldviews are going to think I have completely missed the mark. He then says, I am about to do something that no other Jewish thinker has done before. And he sort of asks himself this implicit question of, why am I daring to do this? And here's where it gets interesting, and here's why I brought the source. He says, I have relied on two precedents. First, similar cases, our sages applied the verse, it is time to do something in honor of the Lord, for they have made void the Torah, right? Et lahasot lahashem. Now, for people who remember back to, we probably studied this a couple months ago, but I think in class 5 or 6, we dug into the tension of the writing down of the oral Torah. And we talked a lot about this tension that the early rabbis in writing down the Mishnah had between a tradition that was supposed to be orally distributed and what you lose once you start to write down something that's supposed to be orally communicated. And ultimately, Rabbi Judah the Prince or Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi in the year 200 CE decided that the potential dangers of not writing down the oral tradition outweighed the dangers. And he quoted this verse, "It is time to do something for the Lord, for they have made void thy law." So Maimonides is using, again, the same justification that the rabbis in the Talmud do for why he is embarking on this radical shifting of Judaism, right? He then continues, "Secondly, they have said, let all of thy acts be guided by pure intentions. On these two principles I relied while composing some parts of this work. Lastly, when I have a difficult subject before me, when I find the road narrow and can see no other way of teaching a well-established truth, except by pleasing one intelligent man and displeasing 10,000 fools, I prefer to address myself to the one man and to take no notice whatever of the condemnation of the multitude. I prefer to extricate that intelligent man from his embarrassment and show him the cause of his complexity so that he may attain perfection and be at peace." In other words, I don't care if I upset and annoy and bother 10,000, in his words, simpletons or fools, as long as the 1 in 10,000 reads my work, and this eases him from his feeling of anxiety or complexity just a little bit. And this was almost somewhat of a prophetic comment by Maimonides, because early on, after writing his philosophic works that we'll delve into in a second, understandably, the vast majority of the Jewish community hated what he had to say. And we'll see why, because he radically changes notions of Jewish theology, philosophy, and history, and interprets it in a completely different way. Now, one of the things that ends up happening with Maimonides is that slowly over time, his ideas begin to become increasingly mainstream in the Jewish community, to the point where now, again, it doesn't make a difference if you're in the ultra-Orthodox, Orthodox, conservative, or Reform world. A lot of Maimonides' ideas are traditional Jewish, well, of course, this is how we understand this. So that by way of introduction to what Maimonides was trying to do, I'll take a step back and see if we have any comments or questions before we go to 3 or 4 different explicit examples that I think will really tease out Maimonides' philosophy and why he was trying to do what he did. Perfect. Okay. So if we have any comments, again, feel free to always interrupt me. So I want to start.
Michael has a comment.
Oh, yeah. Go for it, Michael.
I went to a synagogue on Passover, entered a Sephardic Passover service by mistake. They invited me in, so I came in. I thought that was the right place I was supposed to be. And the rabbi was presenting Maimonides' explanation for God allowing for the Jewish children to be killed in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
So I won't tell you the rest of the story, except for the fact that at the end of the, about half an hour later, everybody ran away from the synagogue because of the comment. I swear to you, okay, because I said, no, he's wrong. Can you tell the audience about his explanation of what happened, which makes 1.5 million Jewish children in Germany all bad people?
Yeah, so 2 things. So one, we'll get into Maimonides' philosophy in a second. His philosophy can be, well, let's just do the sources, because I'm hoping that'll answer how he ends up getting to a lot of the conclusions that he gets to, right? And I'm not, I mean, just like all Jewish history and Jewish sources, right? Studying any ancient philosophic text or legal text, you're not necessarily, and this is sort of a Jewish mainstream idea for the last multi-thousand years, the purpose of studying is not necessarily for the conclusion, it's for the process, right, of thinking through the difficult case, as opposed to saying any one interpretation by Maimonides is correct. And so he certainly had his controversial views, just like the Talmud has its controversial views, just like Aristotle, who Maimonides bases a lot of his views off of, had controversial views. So Michael, hopefully we'll get back to that towards the end. We can sort of discuss a couple of the practical ramifications today to Maimonides' philosophy. The other thing that I'll say is Maimonides really staked out, right, a pole of Jewish philosophy. And what I mean a pole is he is credited with really being the first Jewish philosopher. And we can talk a little bit more about what that means and really what it means to start a field of Jewish philosophy. One way to almost think of this is Gershom Scholem, who was a famous academic and professor of Kabbalah, writes this famous essay about Jewish philosophy and Jewish mysticism, which he considers to be twin movements. And we'll actually talk next week about Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah, which from some perspective came as a reaction to Maimonides' philosophy, right? Maimonides comes in with a very rationalistic type philosophy and way to view the world. And of course, every time in history, there's a strong view on one side, you can always imagine, an equal opposite reaction on the other side. And so there was a strong surgence of Jewish mysticism that also arose from Spain in the Middle Ages, right? This is when the Zohar was written and other texts. And one of the things that Gershom Scholem says about both the legacy of Jewish philosophy and Jewish mysticism is that they represent a departure for what he calls the naivety of the rabbinic and biblical tradition. Because the biblical and rabbinic tradition, I'm still quoting or paraphrasing from Gershom Scholem, the biblical and rabbinic tradition expressed itself, but it did not reflect on itself. What does that mean? That when the Tanakh or when the Talmud says something, they're not worried about reflecting on it, right? Genesis is not interested in explaining the theological background as to what's happening. When the Talmud has a story about God coming into the Beit Midrash, it's not worried about the fundamental truth claims of what that means, right? This is something, to some extent, what separates mythology from modernity, right? That in some way, and we spoke about this all the way back in the first class, but when the Torah has a story, or the Tanakh has a story, or the Talmud has a story, this is an expression of an idea, right? It's sort of a primary source text. All of a sudden in the medieval ages, and this is one interesting way to think about this inflection point in Jewish history, Judaism is now forced to reflect on itself, meaning there are now outside intellectual forces, really for the first time in Jewish history, that are coming to challenge ideas. And so all of a sudden, Jewish community leaders now have to engage in an intellectual defense of our tradition in a way that the Torah didn't have to. And so it's a completely different, right? It begins a completely new branch and era of Jewish literature, one that, of course, certainly lasts for 1,000 years. Sydney, go for it.
There we go. I think we need to also think about what was going on in the broader context of the whole world, where they had been dealing with surviving through plagues that were going around, and the Catholic Church, as one example, was to just hunker down and say, all we're going to focus on is the old tenets, and we're not going to let anything change. We're not going to let anyone address anything. I mean, if we think about it, Copernicus, I was just Googling him, who said the Earth is not the center of the universe, was afraid to publish it until like 1500. And they wouldn't let any new ideas go on. So, but at the same time, there was this rebirth amongst philosophers that started to reread the Greeks and the Romans, and it just woke up their brain about, the year 1000 or 1100. So he is part of this battle between the orthodoxy that was saying, don't even think, don't ask questions, and this huge rebirth that was just before the Renaissance, but just as intense, that was asking, going back to the incredible intellectualism that was going on in Greece and Rome and Israel, and it's a very intense period of time of don't ask any questions, don't think, no, wait, I'm thinking, my brain is exploding.
Yeah, no, 100%. And yeah, that's spot on. And this was at the number of ideas. I mean, especially we think of Spain and then North Africa and the Middle East at this time. I mean, not only was it orthodoxy versus, the Greek philosophic tradition, it was also the ideas of Islam and the ideas of Christianity and the ideas of Judaism. I mean, another great philosophic work that we could spend time discussing. I mean, we don't have, sadly, this class doesn't go forever, but, it's just worth flagging. And I was hoping to just flag it for a minute next week, is Judah Halevi, who's another Spanish Jewish. Usually he's thought of as a poet, but he was also wrote this famous philosophic book called the Kuzari. And the Kuzari is a book, we can read a small excerpt from it next week, but what this book does is set up a philosophic fictional account of the Khazar king having a conversation with a Jew, a Christian, and a Muslim. And they are each arguing for why their religion is quote unquote correct. And so it's this fascinating philosophic drama that's playing out between all these different thinkers, which for nothing else, this shows us that the Jews at that time were engaged in a critical assessment of their own identity and truth claims. And they were aware of the fact that there are other people living with other ideas of what constitutes truth, religious truth, or philosophic truth. So yeah, I love that. Ruth, did you have a hand raised?
Well, as you were reading, I was thinking to myself, he could be describing himself, because he had to, as a religious Jew coming up against, the Greek and philosophy, he had to reconcile them. So here he's now going to take what he learned and put it forth for others so that they can do the same. I don't know if that's true, but it kind of struck me as you were reading.
No, you're 100%. And listen, he is a complicated figure because there's a tendency, I'll just give one more remark about thinking about historical figures, and then we can get into some of his sources here. There's a tendency to think of historical figures as almost being flat, meaning a lot of people will ask questions like, well, what did Maimonides believe about heaven, right? Which is somewhat of a valid question. And also it begs the secondary question is, what point of his life are we talking about, right? Just like all of us, right? It would be to some extent foolish when thinking about the span of our lives to say, well, what did they think about politics, or what did they think, right? Just like all people, Maimonides evolves. And you can actually see, studying Maimonides is immensely complicated because he was such an important figure that virtually all contemporary Jewish groups want to claim Maimonides for their own, right? It's a fascinating thing where if you ask a group of Reform Jews, right, are you following in Maimonides' footsteps? Of course we are. If you go to an ultra-Orthodox synagogue, are you following in Maimonides' footsteps? Of course we are. There was actually this famous joke that I'm reminded of. There was a scholar, there was a couple years ago, there was a panel of different professors that were all scholars of Maimonides, and they all had vastly different opinions as to what Maimonides actually thought about different issues. And so one professor gives sort of their opening, and another professor who's sort of, half being smug, half telling a joke says, that was really nice. You can have your Maimonides, but I'll take my Maimonides. As sort of a joke, basically saying, you're completely wrong in trying to interpret what Maimonides is actually saying here. And so you're 100% right. And we'll see, right? A lot of the excerpts that we're going to read are sort of towards the end of his life, after a life of what, appears to be really intense religious struggle, right? I don't want to paint the picture of Maimonides as, the second he turned 15 and started thinking critically about the world, he sort of, was this philosophic savant that, of course, knew how to reconcile Judaism with all these ideas, right? I'm fairly certain even at the end of his life, if you ask Maimonides, some of these deep questions, he would still have some uncertainty. And we actually know this is true to some extent because Maimonides ends up writing a lot about, this is, I guess, we'll eventually get into the sources, but just one more story about him. right, he ends up writing a lot about what's called theodicy, right? The sort of age-old religious question of how can God allow bad things to happen to good people? And as a rationalist and philosopher, Maimonides' answer, unlike a lot of other rabbis at the time, was a view of God that suggests a lot less divine direction over the world. And what I mean by that is Maimonides can almost be described as a deist, right? Somebody who sets up the laws of nature, who sets human minds and human self-autonomy, and everything else that happens can basically be acts of nature that have no bigger picture consequences. And so, in the words of, the famous Jewish, question of, if a leaf falls from a tree, is that because God wanted the leaf to fall from a tree? So if you took a time machine and went back to Spain in the year 1100s, and you were to ask most Jews, they would say, of course, nothing happens in the world without God willing it. If you then ask Maimonides, he says, of course, right? God sets into laws, nature, and nature has effects. And sometimes if the tree or the branch is big enough and a human happens to unluckily be walking underneath, that human could get injured, even fatally, and nobody can say, well, God wanted that person to be killed. Now, all of a sudden, Maimonides had a younger brother, and they went into business together. And this younger brother was the sort of crown jewel of the family. And we know all of this from, again, a series of letters found in the Cairo Geniza. And so at a young age, probably in his mid-20s, Maimonides' brother sets out on a business trip, and the ship sinks, and his brother dies in this terrible, tragic accident. And Maimonides, again, right, this is when the human side comes out. Some of his writing on the issue is deeply theological and deeply religious. Now, from some perspective, a scholar who's only engaged in sort of the dry academic conclusions can look at this and say, there's a contradiction. How can Maimonides in one case be the steadfast deistic philosopher that suggests that, no, this is just random? And how can he also be writing in his notes, why does God allow things like this to happen? But then, of course, we realize that Maimonides, just like everyone else, right, is human, right? And there's contradictions that arise in a lot of honest forms of philosophy. Michael, did you have anything to say before we get into some sources?
I just want to say that the Muslims also claim him, don't they?
100%, Michael. Yeah.
As a matter of fact, he was pursued and was going to be executed for converting, so they claimed, from Islam to Judaism.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, there was a movement in both medieval and contemporary Islam to also claim Maimonides as a Islamic thinker, and one of the reasons for that is that Maimonides, as a religious philosopher, greatly influenced both the legacy of medieval Islamic philosophy, and then eventually, once the Christian world came around to some of their rationalism, most famously Thomas Aquinas, he was also very influenced by Maimonides. So was Baruch Spinoza, right? Oftentimes thought to be the founder of modern secularism, was also deeply affected by Maimonides. And so, right, the influence of his thought, right, goes far and wide. Okay, Ruth, last question or comment, and then we're getting into some sources.
No, apropos of his conversion, I use air quotes. On this program that I was watching, on this webinar, all you had to recite a line, and that made you a Muslim. And they said, that as long as he said it, they let him, but they hightailed it out of there. I mean, once he said it, and they thought that, he was now a Muslim, then the whole family took off.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And one of the interesting things that comes out, right, so just to give a little bit of historical background, and then I promise we will go into the text in a second, is that, right, earlier on in his life, when Maimonides was caught in this inter-Islamic skirmish still happening in Spain, right, he was, to some extent held under captive of a radical Islamic group that basically wanted him to forcibly convert. And he actually famously writes in a series of responsa later on in his life, right? We don't know exactly what happened, right? Because again, this is before everybody's life, had everything documented on social media, right? So, it's a historical guess as to what exactly happened there, which leads to different conclusions. But he writes a series of famous letters later on in his life, where he claims that a Jew is allowed to convert to Islam under threat of violence. And so a lot of people make this connection. Well, if Muslims have been spending 1,000 years saying Maimonides converted to Islam, and later on in his life, Maimonides explicitly writes it's okay to convert to Islam under threat of violence, and he was magically able to escape, right, this situation where a lot of Jews were actually killed for not converting to Islam, right? It's pretty easy to put that puzzle together, right? Within a Jewish legacy, right? Again, for the rest of his life, once he ends up moving to Morocco, then Israel, and then Egypt, right? There's very little Islamic anything, right? So anyone who thinks he lived the rest of his life, happily ever after as a Muslim is almost certainly misguided. Okay, getting into some of Maimonides' philosophy, and again, some of these ideas, right? They're not necessarily novel, but the novelty, at least of these beginning ideas, is the way that he frames this in a philosophic way. And so just as I hinted before, right, you read through the Torah and you read through the Talmud, and there are certainly philosophic ideas that are talked about, but they're never stated as this, then this, then this, right? So this work reads much more like a Greek philosophic treatise or even a contemporary philosophic treatise rather than anything Jewish, which was some of the radical nature here. But he writes, and this is actually not in the Guide to the Perplexed, this is in the Mishnah Torah, which he wrote before the Guide to the Perplexed. He says, the foundation and foundations and the firmest pillar of wisdom is to know that there is a first being, that he caused all beings to be, and that all beings from heaven and earth and from between them could not be saved from the truth of his own being, right? This is almost verbatim from Aristotle, right? What many people in the contemporary world would call the primary mover argument, right? He goes into what that means, right? This being is the God of the universe, Lord of the whole earth, who guides the sphere with an infinite force, a force of perpetual motion, for the sphere revolves continuously, which would be impossible without someone causing it to revolve. And it is he, blessed be he, who causes it to revolve without hand and without body, right? So the very fact, right, I'm paraphrasing Maimonides here, the very fact that we have nature, that the earth is spinning, means there must have been some force that sets that into motion, right? You can think of this scientifically or philosophically, right? So there must be something at the bottom of it all, right? If you ask, why did this cause this to cause this, right? Eventually you get back to what he calls the foundation of foundations and firmest pillar. Now he says something interesting. To know this matter is a mandatory commandment, right? Now, this is a very important line because Maimonides says something that should strike us as a little bit strange when talking about theology. He doesn't use the word believe. He uses the word yodea, right? Not emuna, right? If you wanted to say, I believe in God, you would say, ani ma'amin, right? I believe. Right, Maimonides, for Maimonides, this is the first important principle of his Jewish philosophy. Certain things were not about faith. They were actually about philosophic knowledge. And this is, again, something that disconnected him from mainstream Jewish thinking. Because, again, if you were to ask a lot of Jews, both in the medieval world and in the contemporary community, what are those things, what do you think about God? What do you think about the world? Someone might start their sentence by saying, well, I believe that God XYZ, or I don't believe God XYZ, right? Maimonides, right? It was either you know something or you don't know something, right? There's no belief, right? So he says, to know this matter is a mandatory commandment. I am the Lord thy God, right? The first of the 10 commandments. Therefore, whoever supposes that there is another God behind this one violates a prohibited commandment saying, you should have no other gods before me, right? The second commandment. And is an atheist denying the great principle upon which everything depends, right? Then he goes on, he says, this God is one God. He is neither two nor more than two, but one to whose unity there is no comparison among the individual units in the universe, not like the units of a genus, which embraces many individual units, nor like the units of a body, which is divisible into parts and particles, but a unit to whose unit no other unit in the universe is like. Supposing that there are many deities is equivalent to an admission that they are corporeal, because like individual beings do not differ save in chance traits, characteristics of bodies, and material things only. Thus, supposing the creator to be corporeal and material would force a conclusion that he is finite, for it is impossible to imagine a body which does not end in dissolution. But our God, blessed is his name, beholding that his power is infinite and uninterrupted, for lo, the universal physical sphere continues to revolve forever. His power is positively not a physical power, and because he is incorporeal, none of the chance traits, characteristics of bodies, so as to be divisible or an offshoot of another being, can be attributed to him. Therefore, the impossibility for him to be but one, and the knowledge of this doctrine of monotheism is a mandatory commandment, saying the Lord our God is one God, right? We say it in Shema, right? So Maimonides starts off with his famous, this is probably one of the most famous and recognizable components of Maimonides' philosophy, which is not only can you not say anything physical about God, you actually can't say anything descriptive about God, right? And I'll get into a little bit about what that means. And here's where he wades into some philosophic controversy. So he asks the implicit question on himself. So we'll read this and then we'll take time for some discussion. He asks the obvious question. If so, wherefore it is written in the Torah, and there was under his feet, or written with the finger of God, or in Exodus, the hand of the Lord, or in Deuteronomy, the eyes of the Lord, or in Numbers, the ears of the Lord, and more like expressions. So his implicit question is, what about the hundreds of times in our tradition where it explicitly gives God a physical characteristic? So what does he say? All such terminology is in accordance with the conception of sons of man, who cannot recognize aught but corporeal things, and the words of the Torah is like human speech, right? This famous line, right? Where he says that the Torah is basically talking to humans. So oftentimes the Torah says something that actually is not true, but says it in a way that humans can understand. And so he goes on, again, we don't need to read the rest of this. I'll keep it here if people want to read as I'm skimming, but he ends up concluding, just to read the first sentence here. Now, since the matter is so, all such and such other expressions in the Torah and in the words of the prophets are merely proverbial and figurative. And so he goes out to explain, again, countless examples, and then he writes again, right? So we'll read this and then we'll discuss, right? This is how he summarizes it in the Guide to the Perplexed. Here he says it straight out, one of his philosophic rules. He says, know that when you make an affirmation ascribing another thing to God, you become more remote from him in two respects. One of them is that everything you affirm is a perfection only with reference to us. And the other is that he does not possess a thing other than his essence. What does that mean for us, for religious thinkers? Maimonides is saying two things. One is that every time you try to understand God, and you can try to understand God by explaining God, by defining God, by giving God attributes, you are actually distancing yourself from God, right? This is a completely 180 departure from earlier philosophic treatises of any tradition that spent their time, right? You know, I'm thinking primarily Christian philosophy and early Christian theology, but of course, Judaism and Islam had their fair share of this, which spent all their time trying to give concrete descriptions of theological ideas and terms. Maimonides comes in and basically says, anytime you try to do that, you are actually furthering yourself from God. Why? Because let's say I come here and tell you that God is good, or God is just, or God is kind. Well, let's tackle that for a second. I happen to know, let's say, Cindy. And I think that Cindy is also just and kind and good and nice, right? But the problem that Maimonides has is that Cindy is a finite creature, right? Cindy is a human, right?
No, I'm a god. I'm a goddess.
Cindy is
Let's
a god.
just
I
go
love
there.
it.
Right.
No,
Yeah.
I picked the one wrong example. But another human, by virtue of their finitude, right, cannot be fully good or fully perfect or fully just. And so we already have a human cognitive bias. When I say that somebody is a nice person, we have a human conception of what it means to be nice. And it's our experience with other nice people. When we try to describe God, who is infinite, with that character attribute, we are actually perverting our idea of God. because there's an unbridgeable gap, right? This is when he gets into some of his knowledge of Greek philosophy and actually the legacy of Arabic mathematics, right? This is actually just at the point for those who are more mathematically minded, right? This is around the time when Islamic and Greek philosophers are teasing out ideas of infinity, right? And what it means to introduce infinity into equation, and what it actually means to introduce zero into an equation, and asymptotes, and sort of all those things, right, we might have learned in high school math that have since forgotten about, right? But one thing that probably everybody remembers is the second you introduce infinity into an equation, nothing else matters, right? Infinity either breaks an equation or renders all other variables incomplete, right? It doesn't make a difference if you add 8 to infinity, or if you subtract 8 from infinity, or if you subtract 800,000 from infinity, right? It's still infinity. And that's what Maimonides is trying to explain about God, is that when you try to describe God using any human attributes, it's as if I sit here and I say, infinity equals 20,000. And Mark says, no way, infinity equals 800,000. And Maddie says, no, infinity equals 800 million, right? Those are all equally incorrect, right? And to some extent, it doesn't even map out, right? There's a fundamental brokenness in even trying to depict that, right? The equation, right, just can't cease to function. So this is what he says about God, right? Anytime a finite being tries to understand God, they are falling into this cognitive error, and they are basically ceasing to be talking about God. And so he says the other thing is that he does not possess a thing other than his essence. And so he says if something is infinite and one with a capital O, it means that that thing has no other adjectives, right? God is, right? That's the only thing we could say about God, right? There's nothing else. There's no other attributes that one could say about God whatsoever. Now, this presents a big problem, right? This presents a huge problem for religion to some extent, right? This is the Greek philosophic notion to some extent of God, mixed in with a little bit of, interesting biblical quotes that he uses to defend this idea. But the next question, and the question that Maimonides then ends up having to spend the bulk of his book defending, is twofold. One, he still affirms the truth of the Torah. And the last time I checked, right, we are now, still towards the beginning of the book of Exodus, right, in our weekly study through the Parshiot. In the first 15 chapters of the book of Exodus, there must be 200 references to something God does, or an emotion that God feels, or something that God commands, right? How do you bridge that gap, right? How does Maimonides' God that you can't describe, how do you bridge that gap with the Torah's God, who clearly gets angry, who is happy, who commands, who wants something from us? So that's the first question. The second is, how do you get close to this God? Meaning, from some conception, if the point of religion, right, this of course isn't the only point of Judaism, but if somebody were to make an argument, which I would agree with, and say, one of the points of Judaism, or the goals of Judaism, is to get closer to God, and this is a God that you can't touch, define, describe, do anything but affirm the existence of, right? How do you then get closer to that entity? So taking a step back, I see that there are a couple of comments in the chat. One of the comments in the chat that was actually directly messaged to me saying, what about mitzvot, right? So that's the exact question. Mark Philwood said, God made us in his image. Mark, what do you mean by that in terms of this context?
Well, it seems that if you have human attributes given to God in various portions of the Torah, that's consistent with God making us in his image.
I see. So almost using that to challenge Maimonides' assumption to some extent?
I would never be that brash to actually challenge Maimonides, but I'm asking the question, if God made us in his image, why is it wrong to use those attributes to describe God?
If I were Maimonides, what I would say is because that's just plainly false, meaning he wasn't worried. I mean, the reason why he was such a radical thinker was because he believed fundamentally that the Torah was true, and fundamentally that the world of science and philosophy were true. When they conflicted, because he felt that they were both true, he had to find a way forward. What he actually famously writes, right? he's actually responding, right? There was a trend in medieval Jewish theology. This is obviously a trend that Maimonides had beaten down so much that today I don't think you'll meet any Jew that believes this, but a actually growing trend to think of God as a physical entity in Judaism, right? And again, if you read the Tanakh at face value, literally, even if you read rabbinic literature, face value or literally, over and over again, right? It seems like God has human attributes, right? You know, the sort of stereotype is the old man sitting in a rocking chair, right? That's certainly the image of God you get from much of the Torah, from a large perspective. And so a lot of early medieval Jewish thinkers, specifically, by the way, a lot of Ashkenazi, so under the Christian world, medieval Jewish thinkers, actually defined humans being created in the image of God as physical, right? That to some extent, God is a more perfect human form, to some extent. Maimonides makes this all intellectual. And so what Maimonides says, and actually his answer to the question that I sort of laid out before, is, well, if humans can't approach God in any descriptive way, how do humans actually approach God? Well, the one godly capacity that humans have is our intellect, right? Again, the Rambam, Maimonides was a philosopher and intellectual. And so he describes religion and Judaism specifically as a path to both what he calls better the social order and sharpen the intellect. And this then becomes his two big goals. And so his entire premise of approaching Judaism, and we'll actually see this in a second through other sources, is basically to say that God is the ultimate truth, and humans as intellectual beings that were endowed by God with a godly faculty have ability to tease out truths in the world, right? There are philosophic truths, scientific truths, moral truths, as he writes, and the greater you become, the more truth, right, you are able to understand, right? We all understand what it means if somebody is wise. And at a certain point, right, nobody can ever reach God, right? He quotes the famous story that we're actually going to be reading in synagogue in a week or two of God, or probably 3 or 4 weeks, of Moses asking God to show me your glory, right? It's this famous story after the golden calf where Moses comes to God and says, you know, Hareini na et kavodecha, right? Show me your glory. And God basically responds, no human could see my glory and live. So Maimonides takes that and says, humans can never reach a full understanding of God, but they can get awfully close, right? And in the story, Moses is actually able to see the back of God's head. And he, of course, interprets this all as a philosophic allegory, is that humans can get close, but never there. And this is actually the framework that Maimonides uses to explore virtually every Jewish question, right? The way that Maimonides understands prophecy, let's just give this an example, right? Because there's a notion of prophecy where from some, you know, ultra traditional perspective, if somebody asks, well, what does it mean to receive prophecy, right? When we say that Abraham or Moses or Isaiah, right, were prophets, what do we mean by that, right? So one understanding is that Abraham was just, you know, minding his own business in the city of Ur, and one day, you know, the clouds departed and said, you know, Abraham, you know, go out of your father's house, go to the land I will show you. And Abraham is looking around and, you know, understands he's talking to a higher power. And that's, you know, obviously one view of prophecy. Maimonides writes that prophecy is much more of a spectrum of wisdom, is that the truths are already out there in the world for everybody to acquire, but almost the difference in thinking of prophecy as an act of God starting the prophecy from almost the truth being, you know, almost you could think of it as a radio wavelength. And once you acquire a certain level of understanding of the world and ethical perfection and philosophic wisdom, you are just able to tune into truths that everybody else is not able to approach because they haven't yet reached that understanding. And so this becomes, again, the framework that Maimonides drives in throughout his entire philosophy. Madeline asked, just to go over some of the questions, is it a limit of translation, or is Maimonides using male pronouns? No judgment, just curious. Maddie, it's a great question. And long answer short is that Hebrew is just a gendered language in general. And so oftentimes, right, it just is written in the male form. So yeah, there obviously are a lot of modern translations that attempt to gender neutralize it. A lot of times actually that ancient Jewish texts do use things in the male form. It probably is a gender neutral connotation. It just ends up being written in the male form, just because that ends up being the sort of de facto Jewish form that's used. And then Ruth says the Greeks and Romans anthropomorphize their God, right? Yes, exactly, right? So Maimonides was extremely against any type of anthropomorphization of God whatsoever, right? And he was also, again, he ends up being very strict on this, right? Actually similar to, this is one way in which Maimonides' philosophy and Islam become very, very similar, right? Obviously Islam, right? There's a lot we can talk about, right, the not drawing any pictures of Muhammad, right? That is something that obviously the Muslim world gets quite up in arms about, right? There's actually a recent example of a professor getting fired on the spot after showing a picture in a class, basically to show a great example of medieval Islamic art, right? That's a whole different story, but a lot of the same ideas, right? Maimonides writes about God, right? Not prophets, because Maimonides would say that the deification of a prophet is basically tantamount to heresy, because there's God and then there's humans, and there's no third category, right? There's no humans that are more godlike than other humans, but it would be a similar thing. And so a lot of the followers of Maimonides were very against, let's say, any type of art or poetry or any of these things, especially in synagogue. And so actually it's an interesting thing today. There are a lot of synagogues that have art, and then a lot that specifically refrain from art because of this wider debate. And so one way in which, again, we won't read all of the primary sources here. Oh yeah, somebody sent me a comment just to clarify one thing. Maddie, this is more for you, that the Guide to the Perplexed was originally written in Arabic, actually, right? Maimonides was living under Islamic rule, so his philosophy was written in Arabic, and Arabic also has similar gendered tones to Hebrew. Okay, so just to flag a couple of mainstream Maimonides ideas, right? We don't have to read all of these, but I'll share this link if people want to go through and actually read all these primary sources. One such claim that Maimonides then makes is that all mitzvot, all commandments, have to have logical reasons. And he goes through and painstakingly tries to argue that everything the Torah commands, from circumcision to the laws of kosher to everything Jews do ritualistically, to make sense in a philosophic and logical way. And so Maimonides hated the answer because God said so, right? There is nothing that's because God said so. It either makes sense or it doesn't. And this, again, leads him to quite interesting conclusions, right? So famously, he writes, right, this is one famous one that a lot of people sort of intuitively have heard before, that why do Jews keep kosher? Well, because the kosher diet is healthier than a non-kosher diet, right? We can, of course, debate the merits or the lack of merits of that argument another time, but this is very representative of Maimonides' wider philosophy, where he basically, just to read one quote, this is how he introduces his section on mitzvot. He says, I am prepared to tell you my explanation of all these commandments and to assign for them a true reason supported by proof, with the exception of some minor rules and of a few commandments I mentioned above, right? There's a couple that he actually admits that he doesn't yet understand, right? I will show that all these and similar laws must have some bearing upon one of the three following things. So he basically says, anytime you get a Jewish law, it's doing one of these three things: the regulation of our opinions, the improvement of our social relations, which implies two other things: the removal of injustice and the teaching of moral goods. So according to Maimonides, every single mitzvah that somebody does is either trying to regulate our worldview in some positive way, teach us some good morals, or better society in some way. Again, we can debate the merits of that another time, but this is classic Maimonides philosophy, right? We discussed this idea before that Maimonides writes, but he radically was a naturalist in the sense where he did not think that you can ascribe theologic reasons to things happening in the world, right? So if something happens, right, whether good or bad or random, Maimonides says, well, that's just nature, right? That's not God saying, why does God cause, let's say, an earthquake to happen, would be a non-question for Maimonides, because that is, again, ascribing some human agency to God, albeit a much more powerful human that can cause earthquakes. But for Maimonides, again, that question didn't even map out. He writes again, right, this is just a fun historic view of Maimonides, one in which I actually really appreciate, right? He writes also about animal sacrifices, right? This is something that I think allows a lot of people who get caught up in the book of Leviticus to breathe a little bit a sigh of relief, right? Maimonides was to some extent an anti-sacrifice thinker, even though, of course, right, he writes in his Mishnah Torah in the laws of Judaism, he, of course, talks about the laws of sacrifice, but he has a radical historic idea that the reason why the tabernacle in the desert or the temple in Jerusalem was full of animal sacrifice was because of, in the ancient world, the primary way to worship God was human sacrifice. And God hated all type of sacrifices. And so Moses, right, as a prophet inspired by God, which is how Maimonides thinks of the writing of the Torah, wanted a way to almost wean humans off of the need for sacrifice at all. But as he says, it is impossible for one to go from one extreme to the other, right? And so if Moses would have said the day they leave Egypt, okay, no more sacrifices, right? The way you worship God is via meditation or prayer or singing, nobody would have gone for that, right? They would have said, well, what do you mean? Yesterday in Egypt, they were sacrificing all sorts of things, and today you're going to tell me that there's no sacrifices. And so he basically describes a process in which there was a slow stage of weaning humans off the need of sacrifices. So these are just a couple of sort of the highlights of Maimonides' view. And I want to end with the most provocative one, and then we can have a short little conversation. I see just two questions before we go there. Somebody asks, what does he do with classic questions like the red heifer, right? So there's the famous case in the Torah where you have impurity, and the way that you can become pure is by killing this, what's called para aduma, right? This red heifer. But paradoxically, everybody who prepares the red heifer becomes impure, and everybody who then partakes in the ashes becomes pure. And so Maimonides, this is actually one case in which Maimonides basically throws his hands up and says, I don't actually know yet, right? So he doesn't claim to have all the answers, but he said, one day this could be figured out. And Brenda says, isn't there a Hebrew and Arabic law being in the same family? Brenda, what exactly do you mean by that?
I mean, isn't there just a rule that they do belong in the same family?
The same family meaning the languages?
Yes.
Oh, interesting. Maybe. I actually don't know enough about the two languages to but I would guess, they're both obviously, Middle Eastern languages. There is a lot of overlap, and there are a lot of Arabic words that are the same as Hebrew. So it very well could be. So just in concluding Maimonides, we'll end with this short paragraph that has been the center of the most amount of attention and controversy by scholars of Maimonides. And this, again, sets us up for a very interesting conversation of the limits of such a view. And this is probably the most cryptic and controversial thing that Maimonides has ever said, which again, I mentioned last week, but if there is ever an award for the book that has been burned the most by Jews in history, it was this book, Guide to the Perplexed. Because after this book got sent out to the Jewish world, people hated these ideas so much that they considered these books absolute heresy. And actually, interestingly enough, today in the ultra-Orthodox world, a lot of the ultra-Orthodox community is engaged constantly with Maimonides' legal codes, right? We talked a little bit last week about the rise of legal codes. So the Mishnah Torah that Maimonides wrote, they study every day. And Maimonides also wrote a commentary to the Mishnah, right, that's studied every day. But you're actually not allowed to read Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, because of some of these provocative ideas. And so here is what he writes at the end of a particularly lengthy section where he tries to explain a lot of the things in the Torah and how they are not necessarily literally true, but metaphorically true. He then concludes as follows. Scripture further demands belief in certain truths, the belief in which is indispensable in regulating our social relations. Such is the belief that God is angry with those who disobey him, for it leads us to the fear and dread of disobedience to the will of God. In other cases, that truth is only the means of securing the removal of injustice or the acquisition of good morals. Such is the belief that God is angry with those who oppress their fellow men, as it is said, my anger will be kindled and I will slay, etc., or the belief that God hears the crying of the oppressed and vexed to deliver them out of the hands of the oppressor and tyrant, as it is written, and it shall come to pass when he will cry unto me that I will hear, for I am gracious. So Maimonides leaves us with this cryptic idea that oftentimes the Torah or Jewish tradition says certain truths that are not philosophically true, but they're socially true, right? Almost an analogy, right? A personal analogy of this would be the belief of, I'm almost imagining, if you're trying to convince a little kid why they shouldn't, do something wrong, you say, well, because you're going to get, punished by God, as opposed to trying to explain to them the intricate moral complexities as to why they shouldn't steal something from a store, right? Or something like that. And so Maimonides sets up basically a situation in which he is saying there are some ideas that the Torah and Jewish texts, and then to some extent, Jewish institutions and leadership, where they are good ideas, but they're not actually true in any philosophic sense. They're true in a pragmatic sense, right? This is actually, for those who are interested in modern religious philosophy, this is very similar to almost William James, right? He was the famous psychologist and philosopher, right? He started a school of thought known as pragmatism, where you judge to some extent, you judge the truth of a lot of claims by whether or not they have real world effect. And so Maimonides is, in a sense, leaving us off with this idea where, again, he's hinting, right? This is why there's so much controversy over how to actually encapsulate Maimonides' views, because he basically ends up by saying, well, everything in the Torah is true, but how it might be true, well, I'm going to be a little bit more cryptic and explaining exactly what I mean by that, which again opens the door to thinking perhaps there are things in the Torah that aren't true in any philosophic or historic sense, but they're true in terms of a moral perfection or social regulatory sense. And so again, Maimonides, just to sort of conclude our unit here on Maimonides, again, next week we'll talk about a potential backlash to the Maimonidean revolution, which was the rise of Jewish mysticism in the medieval Sephardic world. But again, you can imagine how both important and radical at the same time a thinker like this was in Jewish history, because he basically flips on its head classic Jewish theology and religion in an attempt to, again, bridge two worlds that at that time were viewed as diametrically opposed, right? Before Maimonides, you were either a philosopher / intellectual or a religious Jew. Today, I think we all take it for granted that you can be both a religious and thoughtful Jew and an intellectual academic person out in the world. And that, of course, there might be tensions through these two worldviews, but when there's tensions, you should actually try to explore it and try to tease out those tensions, as opposed to concluding, well, it's religion, it's faith, right? Faith and science don't mix, right? Maimonides was a radical rejecter of the notion of you have your faith and you have your science, and you shouldn't keep them too close to each other. For Maimonides, there was one truth, right? Religion is true, science is true, and you actually have to figure out how they are true together. And you should never say, right, again, according to Maimonides, well, no, this is just my religious beliefs, as opposed to this, which I have proven in my chemistry lab. And so again, right, the legacy of Maimonides is very complicated, but we can understand why now he gets the sort of epithet of the greatest thinker in Jewish history since Moses, because he radically transforms Judaism in the Middle Ages from, again, being a to some extent, a faith-based tradition that tried to hide in the wake of intellectual challenges to somebody who addressed it head on and opening up to some extent, right? He is the first Jewish philosopher. He is obviously not the last, right? Since Maimonides, right, the Jewish community has produced, right, thousands of philosophers that have constantly thought about big picture questions of Judaism and insert any other adjective or verb you want there. And so he opens the door for a type of Judaism that can engage with the outside world in a deep and thoughtful way, and in a way where, again, he sets the foundation for future inquiry. So when all of a sudden, as opposed to, let's say, the Christian world, when it's discovered that actually the earth doesn't revolve around the sun, right? Jewish religious thinkers, again, from as traditional to as liberal, don't say, well, we should go kill Copernicus. They say, okay, right? I guess we need to reevaluate our beliefs and our philosophy. And even if there are some biblical verses that make it seem like a literalist reading makes it seem like, yes, the earth is at the center of the universe, we have to reinterpret, right? When the theory of evolution comes out, the vast majority of Jewish thinkers, right, even in the Orthodox community, say, okay, I guess we have to reevaluate how we interpret the beginning of Genesis with the theories of evolution. And all of this, again, is due to the thinking of Maimonides. So thank you so much for a nice 10th class. Again, I'm more than happy to stay and hang around for any and all questions of Maimonides. But otherwise, I do actually have one announcement. We actually aren't going to have class next week. I forgot to say that I'm actually going to be out of town for an event. And so I'm going to send this all out in an email just so everybody knows, but we will be back in 2 Mondays for class, and I'll send this all out in an email in case people don't remember.